Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this program today. My name is Tunde Olatunji. I am the Associate Director of Policy here at the Africa Center. For those who've been with us for programs before, we're happy to have you back. And for those joining us for the first time, welcome. Before we get started, just a little bit about the Africa Center. We are a multidisciplinary institution focused primarily on narrative change around the continent of Africa. So for us, we think it's important what kind of information gets to shape our understanding of the place and its people, but also who gets to communicate that information. As part of that work, we put on public programs such as this one today, which is on the mining industry, global green energy ambitions in general, and the role that transition minerals mined in Africa can play in that global picture. To help us with that, we are joined by three panelists who will help us get smarter about all of these issues. First, we have Fitsum Wildegiorgis, who is a senior research consultant and an industry fellow with the Sustainable Minerals Institute at the University of Queensland in Australia. He's also an associate at the International Institute for Environment and Development in London. Over 10 years, he's worked in applied academic research, specializing in socioeconomic impacts, structural transformation, and resource governance. Fitsum is currently a PhD scholar at the University of Queensland and holds a Master of International Economics and Finance from the same university. His PhD research examines economic linkages in the mining and quarrying sectors of resource-rich African countries and Australia as well, really emphasizing the relevance of these kinds of sectors to economic transformation. We're also joined by Viola Tarus, who is a policy advisor on tax and extractives with the International Institute for Sustainable Development in their economic law and policy program. She works to address tax base erosion and profit sharing in the mining sector. She's trained as an economist, specializing in extractives, and prior to joining IISD, Viola held positions with Oxfam and the National Oil Corporation of Kenya. She holds a master's degree in energy studies from the University of Dundee and earned her Bachelor of Economics and Statistics from the University of Nairobi. Viola is also based in Nairobi. And last but not least, we're joined by Vuyisile Ncube, who is the Corporate Advocacy Coordinator for the Making Clean Energy Clean program at Earthworks. She leads the campaign's advocacy for automakers to transform their supply chain so that they're equitable and free from human rights and environmental rights abuses. She began her career as a postgraduate researcher with the South African Research Chair in Mineral Law in Africa, and has worked to protect communities' rights to a healthy environment and on land and housing rights for marginalized communities. She's an admitted attorney of the High Court of South Africa and a graduate of the University of Cape Town, where she earned both her bachelor's and master's of law degrees. Thank you all for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you. Let's just get started, I think. So we'll start with you, Fitsum, if you don't mind. So a lot of this conversation will reference the mining and industry and what we will refer to as transition minerals. And I was hoping you could sort of start us off with an explanation of what these are, why the demand for these minerals has started to increase recently, and where are they located globally?
Thank you, Tunde and the Africa Center for having me. I think there's no really commonly agreed definition as to what transition minerals are, which, by the way, are also referred to as critical minerals, strategic minerals, or green minerals. While critical or strategic minerals may be broadly scoped to incorporate minerals that are used or for energy technology, digital technology, and the technology that is used in various sectors, including the health sector. For our purpose, I think transition minerals can be conceived as minerals that are used as feedstock in the technology for transition to cleaner energy, such as solar PV plants, wind farms, and electric vehicles or EVs. So, for example, lithium, nickel, manganese, and cobalt are the primary cathode chemistry. That is the positive charge of cells used in to produce lithium-ion battery, which is really critical for electrification and battery storage. Although minerals like lithium, nickel, manganese, and cobalt have gained some prominence over the years, I think there are other minerals that are also considered critical, like copper, aluminum, iron ore, graphite, manganese, uranium, and other minerals. In fact, I would really argue that the word critical really needs to be interrogated as to, what is critical to who and at what stage. But that is something that could be for another day. In terms of demand, certainly the demand for these minerals have risen steadily. For example, since 2010, the average amount of minerals that are needed for a new unit of power generation capacity has increased by about 50%. And this demand is expected to increase by or to quadruple by the year 2040, according to the International Energy Agency. So this is largely due to the global shift toward cleaner energy production and consumption. And this is mainly influenced by the Paris Climate Agreement, in which countries have committed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by mid of this century. So you can see that cleaner energy technology is quite mineral intensive and generally requires more minerals than what would be required for fossil-based technologies. So just as an example, a typical electric car would require around 6 times more minerals than a conventional car would require. Similarly, an onshore wind plant would require around 9 times more minerals than a gas-fired power plant, for example. So in terms of deposits, these minerals are interestingly concentrated in few countries. For example, the International Energy Agency lists 16 countries as having most of these minerals. So for example, the Democratic Republic of Congo is home to around 70 to 75% of cobalt. Australia is home to around 50% or more than 50% of lithium, which is followed by Chile. In terms of nickel, Indonesia is home to around 40% of the global nickel. Copper, Chile, followed by Peru, China, are really home to global, large amounts of global copper. When it comes to African countries, the DRC and Zambia, for example, account for around 10% of the global copper. Other minerals are also found in Africa. For example, the so-called PGM, platinum group mineral or metals, are found in large amounts in these countries.
Let me jump in there really quickly, just because there was a lot there, and I want to make sure people have time to process, and also we don't. So your point's well taken. Transition minerals can refer to a bunch of these minerals, but for our purposes, we're referring to those that are useful in the production of these EV batteries, and those are things like lithium, nickel, cobalt, and manganese. and the demand has increased because these are really energy intensive processes. And you spoke about getting from about how intensive these processes are. And Viola, I want to come to you really quickly and fit some kind of walked us there a bit, but he alluded to the fact that from the mines to these batteries, a lot of energy, a lot of effort, a lot of things go into that. And I was hoping you could just briefly explain to us the process from the mineral being mined to getting put in a car for an electric battery, and sort of where Africa and the countries that Fitsum mentioned, where do these countries generally fall?
Thank you so much, Tunde, and pleased to be here. And I'd like to start my intervention by just echoing what Fitsum has mentioned, that to produce these battery minerals, you require, to produce the battery, you require the EV battery, you require a couple of minerals. So just not graphite, which is the key, or the cobalt, the key conversion that's happening, you require the iron, the steel, and the copper. So once you have all these minerals, now let's look at the value chain on how to get these minerals to how all these are assembled together. So briefly, I can divide the mining value chain into three. So we have the upstream, we have the midstream, and then we have the upstream. So the upstream is where the actual extraction of the resources from the ground happen for all these minerals. So that's the extraction stage. And then we go to the midstream. This is where refineries are involved. So once you extract what you have, the finished product is called concentrate. And then now when you go to the midstream level is where now you refine the concentrates into the to refined products. And then now here, the midstream, you can also develop the cells, you can also develop the modules from out of these minerals. And then now you go to the last stage, which is the downstream stage. And then now this is where what you call the industrialization, integration, or the assembly into now these different vehicles, or whatever end use for these EV batteries. So that's basically the mining value chain. And as you go high up the value chain, the more value you get out of your resource. So countries that get to process their minerals, that will fetch more money than those who just extract and sell. So that's how it works from an economic point of view and from a value point of view. A lot of African countries, again, as Fitsum mentioned, a couple of African countries produce these minerals that are considered critical. So a lot of them only undertake the extraction, or they only participate in the upstream value chain. The midstream value chain, a lot of China really dominates the midstream value chain. And then when you go now upstream, we also, downstream, which is the last stage, we have a lot of, again, China participating and the EU. And now that will tell you if Africa is participating in the upstream, we have China, and we have China and EU up the value chain. You can take a guess which region is getting more out of the value for these minerals.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's really helpful. And it really does sound like a story we've heard before, right? With African countries kind of being relegated to the raw commodities part of the value chain, and not really reaping the full benefits of these minerals that they're mining. Vuyisile, could you help us kind of map out the stakeholders in this sector a bit more? I think even inside of these countries, I think the way these operates, could you just give us a sense of who the main actors are and a sense of what the dynamics are between them and where the leverage usually is?
Sure, Tunde, and thank you to the Africa Center for hosting this panel. I'll use South African example. I'm based in South Africa, and as Fitsum mentioned, South Africa is home to platinum group metals, but it's also home to 75% of the world's manganese reserves. And these reserves are found in the Northern Cape, right? And so what you find in the Northern Cape in terms of the different stakeholders is largely a rural surrounding communities where there's high levels of poverty and inequality. So we have about 50% of women in the Northern Cape who are living below the poverty line. You have 23 mining companies that are operating in the Northern Cape. And this is according to the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy's database. So not too sure how up to date the database is, but according to what the government says, there are 23 mining companies that are operating there. And then in terms of the dynamics, South Africa is unique because there's a legal requirement when you're applying for a mining right to also apply for a social and labor plan. So the social and labor plan contains the comprehensive development programs that a mining company says that it will implement for the benefit of the surrounding communities. And so what you would think would be the case with 23 mining companies operating in the region is that there would be programs that actually benefit communities because this is legally required. But that isn't a case. We have a systemic issue of lack of compliance with social and legal plans in South Africa, which also raises another stakeholder that we have, which is our regulatory and enforcement bodies, right? So in most countries, you'll have the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy or a mineral regulatory body, a body that regulates water and sanitation, and another body that will regulate the environment and issues when it comes to like forestry and fisheries, which is the case in South Africa. But the stakeholder that we have in South Africa has a severe lack of enforcement capacity. And so what you see the dynamic being on the ground is that mining companies overwhelmingly have the resources, have the leverage, and communities who are supposed to be involved and who are supposed to be engaged and meaningfully consulted in terms of the constitution, aren't able to participate meaningfully within the industry. And so that's a bit about an example of how the dynamic can sometimes work on the ground.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And you mentioned there. Let's stick with the South Africa example. If there are 23 mining companies and there is evidence that there is some bad behavior, would you say it's across the board bad behavior? Those with the opportunity to do so generally do, or there's particularly bad offenders, or is this an industry-wide kind of thing?
So this is an industry-wide problem. We have an industry-wide issue with mining companies not complying with their social and labor plans, which means across the board, so even beyond manganese, in platinum group metals, just all minerals in general in South Africa, companies severely don't comply with their development programs. And we also have issues with our department not having the enforcement capacity. So in terms of enforcing these social and labor plans, but also enforcing environmental protections, we have quite robust laws when it comes to environmental and water protections, but these aren't enforced. And so we have a wide range of issues when it comes to the enforcement capacity of government in South Africa. And this is potentially the story in a range of other African countries.
I imagine that is absolutely the case. I want to step back out a bit and look at this from a macro perspective. I'll stay with you for a second, Vuyisile, and just talk about these global green energy ambitions in general. And want to ask, so you have all these countries that set all these targets, right? They say we want to stop using fossil fuel engines, for example, by set date, and we're going to do all these transitions. We'll change our energy sector, transportation sector is all going to be geared towards renewables, right? So, and do you think, but at the same time, so as part of this, they're saying we're not going to fund renewable projects in developing countries, but they're also kind of still doubling down on these things at home. And I think what you get, right, is you have African countries that are unable to catch up or even bridge the gap between fossil fuels and mineral and renewables. Anyway, I don't want to answer my question, but my question is there a hypocrisy here in the current model of this transition, or am I being too sensitive?
No, I mean, I think what your question is speaking to is the idea and the prevailing idea that we can address the climate crisis without changing our current models of consumption, right? So you see countries in the global north wanting to retain their levels of like energy consumption, and wanting to build renewable energy, which would require, as Fitsum mentioned, increased levels of mining. And so what we actually need to see, particularly in the global north, is green degrowth, right? And demand reduction. So we need to see policies in the global north that speak to reducing the demand of primary metals that are required and building out a circular economy. So with a lot of minerals, for example, such as cobalt and nickel, there currently are industrial scale recycling that exists. And so it is possible to achieve global recycling rates above 60%. And this is infrastructure that needs to be built out now. So as we are mining for some of these minerals, how do we build up the infrastructure to ensure that we recycle so that we have a circular economy and we don't continue to require mining? And then when I mentioned, demand reduction, which would be the ideal situation and the primary solution, particularly in the global north, what that looks like, for example, in the US, is decreasing dependency on cars, right? So EV vehicles are not going to be a silver bullet in terms of like addressing the climate crisis. We need a decrease in car dependency, which means a robust transportation system in the global north, right-sizing EV batteries. This means where you could produce a huge car, don't produce a smaller car, because that means you require less lithium. And there's research that came out earlier this year by the Climate and Community Project, which mentioned how, if you implement these three interventions, so decreasing car dependency, right-sizing EV batteries, and creating a robust recycling system, you could actually decrease the demand of lithium, as an example, by up to 92% in 2050. So a lot of the hypocrisy that we are seeing in the global north can be addressed. And I think what it boils down to is ensuring that we actually have a systems change and we don't continue with like a business as usual approach, which is what got us into this climate crisis in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's a point that really does need mentioning, is I don't know that demand reduction is as big a part of the suite of responses that we're looking at. I think there's a lot of more effort being put into trying to find ways to pay for the pollution rather than curbing it. Viola, let me come to you, and we've kind of touched on this a bit, though, where Africa falls along this value chain. And it would seem that if we were just to repeat that, what we've done, and we've seen a lot of the places with oil, and if we repeated that with mining for these critical minerals, is there a risk of trapping ourselves in the same cycle of underdevelopment that you can, I think, in some level, in some ways, blame on this oil over dependency across much of the continent? Is it the same? Are the risks the same?
Thanks, Tunde. I choose to be optimistic, and I know a lot of resource-rich countries who especially have mining, who have these critical minerals, I think are very optimistic. And for us, we see this as a second chance of doing it right. So there are countries that have done it very well. Countries like Botswana. They've developed because of their diamond. And to us, this mining boom is an opportunity for countries to rectify that and actually make the most out of their mining sector. So the demand is increasing. There's an opportunity, and especially a lot of countries are looking into value addition. So recently we had the Zambia and the DRC signing a memorandum of an MOU for them to actually develop batteries out of the cobalt and copper. So I see countries now looking forward and see, okay, how can we rectify what we did in the past? How can the state be more involved? How can we relook our policy and mining fiscal regimes together with the legislative framework, our administrative capacity to get it right? Countries like Morocco, for example, have done it right for the longest time, that they have 70% of the world phosphates, and that they've been developing the end product, which is fertilizers and supplying the world. So countries within Africa, there is so much to learn from them, but also we can see that countries are now financially strained because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and now because of climate change, countries who now have oil resources have to strand these resources, which means they have to plug into the budget deficits. Countries like Nigeria that have depended for the longest time on oil, we now know that for climate change, now they have to reduce the extraction. And good point, I can see in the chart, countries like Saudi Arabia that have been producing oil now are now looking to their mining sector. So we see that this is really an opportunity to get these resources, the mining resources, out of the ground and to make the most of it. But it will really require a rethink of how we have been conducting business. It will be business as usual for us to benefit from these resources.
Absolutely. I would absolutely agree. There would probably need to be a change of approach if how things have shaped out is anything to go by. Let me pivot a bit more and shift to the role that we think government plays or could play in this space. I want to come back to you, Fitsum. Just the regulatory environment right now, and I know we're talking about a lot of countries with different governments and different levels of capacity, but could you just maybe characterize how regulated the industry is on the continent, how much variation there may be between countries in terms of this, and sort of, and if that's not too many things, just speak a little bit about how efficiently revenue is collected.
Okay, well, this would really require us to look back in historic trends, simply because regulatory conditions have changed quite a bit over the last 30 years, I would say. But just briefly, starting from the 1990s and 2000s, around 30 sub-Saharan African countries have adopted or pursued a policy which really oriented around attracting foreign direct investment into the mineral sector. And this is largely influenced by the major World Bank report under the title of Strategy for African Mining. And this strategy is really pinned on offering important fiscal and regulatory incentives in order to attract investment. And this has worked. The strategy to attract investment has worked. There has been huge inflows of investment over the years. In fact, as we speak, most of African countries have still managed to attract investment. But there are two unfavorable outcomes to this. Although there has been an increase in exports as a result of this foreign direct investment in many of these countries, the first unfavorable outcome is that the export success has not really turned into an increase in fiscal return or revenue collection, even when prices were high. And this could be due to, some flaws in tax administration, some rent-seeking behavior, tax planning or evading, etc. And the second important unfavorable condition as a result of this is, and this is really important, is that these policies have not really translated into structural transformation of resource-rich African countries. And this is in part due to the what is called as the Dutch disease, which simply refers to, as a result of the increase in exports of minerals, there has been an overvaluation of the exchange rate in many of these countries, which led to the undermining of the competitiveness of other economic sectors, especially the manufacturing and agriculture sectors. And then there has been a decline in production and employment, and then deindustrialization overall. So countries have then introduced some stringent fiscal policies in a bid to really capture revenues. And this is also followed by local content policies, which are also aimed at capturing the significant spend by mining companies on goods and services. But overall, these policies have not really materialized in transforming the economies, despite the significant investment and the increase in exports. Governments using regulatory requirements have increasingly relied upon, the mining industry to deliver on local content without realizing that this alone cannot really lead to broad-based economic transformation, but just, mining-based supply chains. Countries have yet to capture the maximum value of resource rents. For example, the World Bank estimates that the actual value of resource rents is actually 2.6 times that has been actually collected. So there is a huge gap in terms of what these countries are collecting in terms of revenues. So much effort is really needed to improve the fiscal policy in a way that it is stable, competitive, as well as the fiscal administration, which would help maximize revenue collection. Just to mention about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which offers really a great potential for leveraging cross-country comparative advantage in terms of, for example, mineral and financial resources, technology, skills, infrastructure, and above all, the consumer market across the continent. But there is a long way to achieving the full potential, simply because there's so much detail that each of these countries have to work out, let alone the local content policies. But overall, the policies that relate to the mining sector are designed in a way that they are country-focused. And so many countries have some reservations or concerns about being exposed to, regional competitors. And so they would seek, special treatment in terms of trade across the continent. So just overall, there is much left in terms of improving the overall governance, particularly, the ensuring stable political and business conditions that are suitable for the much needed investment into the sector.
So there's a lot of room for improvement would be my understanding of your take. And I don't want to get too far with this, but I think on some level you would expect, right, in an industry so big with so many different players, there will be some bad behavior, and it is the role of government and regulatory bodies to make sure it doesn't get too far to the point where it's negatively impacting people's life. But it would seem a lot of it seems like there's something particularly wrong with the mining sector in Africa, and I wonder, at least it's getting publicity as if they're doing things particularly in a way that is not that doesn't take into consideration the welfare of the people working in these industries. And I wonder, is there anything about the industry that you think predisposes it to this kind of bad behavior, or is this really just no one's looking at this one? It could be any other sector.
I think it's really important to understand that the primary objective of mining companies is really to explore and develop mineral extraction and maximize profits, as well as, at the same time lowering costs. So everything else for them is really, including CSR, corporate social responsibility, is really secondary. So bad behaviors are triggered and actually manifest in various ways. But just to give you an example, we can look at two opposing scenarios, for example. So one is when there are weak regulations and the enforcement of those regulations. Some companies can find ways, for example, to avoid or evade certain tax payments, or involve in illicit financial outflows, exploiting such a weak governance. On the other hand, you can look at cases where mining companies are faced with quite stringent regulatory requirements, in fact, too much regulatory requirements. And in such scenario, companies may still exploit certain loopholes and may engage elites in bribery as an instrument to get certain favors. So you could say that such behaviors are mostly enabled by weak governance in host countries, as well as limited institutional capacity, the lack of clear regulation and implementation, as well as monitoring of those regulations. But it's really important to note that such behavior is not unique to the mining industry, but maybe it's more pronounced because of the capital-intensive nature of the industry, as well as its role in the economy.
Okay, so it's not necessarily that they're acting worse than others. It's just the stakes are higher, and then maybe they are acting higher. They're acting worse, but maybe you're saying you're attributing it to just the scale of the activities going on in there, and the likelihood for bad behavior just becomes higher. Fair. And you were saying better governance policies are absolutely needed. And Viola, let me come back to you. One of the ways countries have tried to deal with this, was a country like Indonesia. Indonesia, they experimented with banning the export of nickel for a number of years. I don't know if that policy is still in place, but it was for a while. What would you think about this for a country like the DRC? What are the risks with the thing like that? Is that worth it?
Great. So you see these practices. So countries are now saying, okay, what can we do different? And okay, we have these critical minerals, and how can we quickly benefit out of it? So we see there's a trend for developing countries who have these critical minerals. So first, some countries like Indonesia started with export taxes. And as Fitsum mentioned, any tax is a cost to the mining companies for these countries. So some countries now have export taxes where they charge taxes if a company is exporting raw products as opposed to refining them in country. So they pay less export taxes if they're going to refine the commodity as opposed to just exporting it raw. So other countries have moved from that. So Indonesia recently, they've completely banned the exportation of nickel. I don't know if that has changed, but another country that is doing that in Africa is Zimbabwe, who I think from December mentioned that they're now going to ban the exportation of lithium. And this is really to encourage value addition. So, okay, they've realized there's benefit in value addition, and then countries are thinking quickly, how can we do this? The problem with now having these export taxes or now banning completely the expectation, and as Fitsum mentioned, you don't only need one commodity to develop, for example, the battery, you need several commodities. So as countries think about doing they have to factor, okay, once we stockpile all the resources, what happens to it? Have we considered if we have the other inputs required for this value addition? Do we have the infrastructure that's necessary for all this? So if you don't think critically about why you have all this, why you have the export taxes, then what it can do is that it's a cost to the mining companies, and that can prohibit foreign direct investments. So it's something that you have to think through before you have then to put these measures to encourage value addition. But in real sense, what's going to do, it's going to work against you.
I see. That's really interesting. I guess I was unfamiliar. I didn't know Zimbabwe had also adopted that policy. That's really interesting. There's this in development discussions now. I feel like this idea of public-private partnerships somehow makes its way into truly every conversation I've had about any sort of proposal to help grow a sector, a public sector. Could you just really briefly explain to us what those are and how a thing like that would work in the mining industry, if at all?
Thanks. So in a world where everything works, there's a role for the private sector, there's a role for the public sector, and especially in the mining sector. And Fitsum mentioned this, that the mining sector is capital intensive. So you need most countries rely on capital provided by the mining or the private investors. There are some countries that have gone just the public sector developing their resources on its own, and it has worked for some. But for some, and this happened years ago when we had the process of nationalization, when a lot of governments took back the mining assets, but not long ago they realized, okay, we can't do this, we need finances, we need the mining sector, and then again began the whole process of privatization. So we've seen this happening. But then and as we work with countries and we support countries, we say there's a situation where we can have a win-win situation, and this is where countries then have to develop a fiscal policies that ensures that them as the owners of the resource get the required benefit and maximum benefit out of it, but at the same time have a legal framework, a fiscal framework that ensures that private companies get a return on their investment. As Fitsum mentioned, these people are in here to make profit. And so you should not deny them the profit, but ensure that as a country who are the owners of this resource, where once you extract, there isn't any left, and you have to consider this generation and future generation, then you have a fiscal policy that ensures that you get the most out of it. There's a trend currently right now that we have a lot more countries with these critical minerals that they are earmarking the production of these minerals for the state-owned companies. And we've seen cases. Botswana is a good example where we have the government in one of the mines that the government has a 50+1 shares, and it has worked very well. But then you have to consider, do you have the capacity to do it? Do you have the resources to do it? And do you have the fiscal framework to ensure that both the private sector and the public sector can both benefit out of it? So countries have really competing needs. Right now, you're talking about a post-pandemic recovery. We have inflations. We have aftermath of climate, what's happening in Mozambique. So governments have competing needs. And so you have to ensure that you're using your resources very well. And for some countries, it might not be into putting so much money into such a capital-intensive, a high-risky project, but you can use your fiscal framework to ensure that whereas the private investor is in there, you can still benefit and ensuring that you're getting the most out of your resource.
Yeah, I completely agree. And for the government, if only because I think you do have a responsibility to your people to make sure that they aren't having essentially their resources and their communities torn up, and also not getting to see any of the benefits from it. I want to see if we have any questions from the audience, but before then, I want to come to you, Vuyisile, really quickly, and just kind of make sure we address the environmental and social challenges that come with a lot of this mining activity. And so when we think mines and riskiness, I think first thing that comes to mind is, okay, it might cave in, there might be some explosion somewhere, but could you just, for laymen like myself, could you just kind of explain to us, give us a better understanding of what are the social and environmental impacts, the major ones that come from mining these transition minerals?
Sure. And maybe just for context, I could share the statistic about the fact that globally, 69% of the current or planned extractive projects for these transition minerals are near or on indigenous people's lands, right? So a lot of these harms that I'm going to be discussing will disproportionately affect indigenous peoples across the world. And one issue that we see is the lack of free, prior, and informed consent. A lot of issues before the mining even comes, indigenous people's rights, frontline communities' rights to engage, meaningfully consult, are not respected by the mining companies. There is issues in certain contexts with forced displacement, and where communities are relocated from their ancestral lands and their homes, they don't receive adequate compensation. And so all of this happens before the mining begins. And then when you have the mining operating, and when you have mining, there are usually issues with water. So this is water quantity and quality. I think we usually think of how mining operations can sometimes pollute nearby river streams or watersheds, but they also affect the water quantity because of how water intensive mining processes sometimes are. There's also issues with environmental degradation and deforestation, depending on the landscape where mining occurs. And then even after mining, there's still issues that a mine will leave, right? So for example, issues such as acid mine drainage. What you find in a lot of contexts, I'll use South Africa as an example as well, is after a mine leaves, there isn't adequate rehabilitation that occurs, right? So a mining company will leave the site where it mined without rehabilitating the land, which means that a lot of that exposed rock, a lot of that exposed mineral ore interacts with rainwater, and there's now acid mine drainage that seeps into underground aquifers. And then in certain instances where mining occurred and tailings dams facilities were built, long after a mine has stopped operating, those tailings dams are still there next to communities. And so there are instances where, those tailings dams failures occur. And when those dams break, then hundreds and thousands of waste goes onto, is released onto communities, which affects groundwater, surface water, soil, vegetation. So there really are a range of impacts from mining that occur before a mine is set up and long after the operations have concluded, where mining companies don't properly rehabilitate and ensure that their operations are rehabilitated and don't further impact communities.
I have to tell you, that is very demoralizing to hear. You got to help us out. What prospects exist for us making things better? How do we prevent? Because it doesn't seem like these conditions, are these necessary conditions for these mining processes, or are there ways to make sure that we're protecting the environment and people better?
I mean, some of these things are avoidable, right? For example, with tailings dams, what we usually say at Earthworks is that the best tailings dam is the one that isn't built at all. So don't build a tailings dam. But where you do need to build a tailings dam, there are requirements that you can put legally in place to ensure you can put strong regulations around tailings dams. So you can ban the use of upstream tailings dam. That, common sense, don't put it upstream where a community is downstream. But then stepping back, there are a wider range of policy mechanisms and legal mechanisms that can be implemented to mitigate or prevent these environmental and social challenges. One, which I mentioned earlier at beginning of the discussion, I mentioned demand reduction. I also mentioned recycling. So where you have contexts where policymakers are making it mandatory to recycle, and where policymakers are making it mandatory for companies to take back their minerals, that alleviates some of the harms from mining, because at some point you would have less mining. An example here is, for example, with the EU battery law that was recently passed. So the EU battery law requires battery makers to recover 90% of used nickel, cobalt, and 50% of used lithium by 2027. And this is very relevant for this discussion, because you can imagine that a lot of EU mining companies, or a lot of EU companies, have supply chains that extend beyond the EU to Africa, to Indonesia, to South America. So those mandatory recycling requirements are very important. Another legal requirement that's important is mandatory human rights and due diligence across supply chains, right? So you can imagine a scenario where, for example, automakers are forced to ensure that their supply chains are free from environmental and human rights abuses. This would mean that their supply chains, which extend to the global south, they would be legally required to ensure that even at the mine level, there are no communities that are negatively impacted by the nearby mine, and that their environment is actually protected. So mandatory human rights and due diligence is a mechanism that would really help mitigate some of the issues at the mine site level. Another mechanism that is useful, or something that companies can do, companies and OEMs, is make their supply chains transparent. So where you see a lot of OEMs or end users, where in an ideal situation, they would publish where their supply chains are. They would publish the extent of their supply chains. And in this day and age, most of these supply chains are global supply chains. But by publishing them and making them transparent, you enable surrounding communities that are impacted by these operations. You enable civil societies that are aware of these egregious companies to engage with you as the end user and as the OEM, to engage with you about how you have someone in your supply chain or a company in your supply chain that is not respecting environmental and human rights due diligence, environmental and human rights. And that allows you as the OEM and the end user company to then try and remedy these violations. And then another final a final thing that could be implemented and that is required, particularly within African countries, is, those robust environmental and human rights laws and free prior informed consent protections. Those would greatly also help mitigate some of the issues that we see at the mine site. I mentioned how in South Africa we have an issue with rehabilitation, and so enforcing laws or passing laws that ensure that mining companies, before they start mining, put up adequate financial provision so that at the end of their mining cycle, they can use that money to rehabilitate where they operated. That is something that would greatly improve the situation for communities that are left behind. Because what you see right now in South Africa is companies are putting up financial provision, but that financial provision isn't being assessed annually. And so by the time we get to the end of life of the mine, which is like maybe years later, that amount isn't enough. And so you can put laws around making sure that that financial provision is assessed regularly so that even after an operation, you can do the adequate rehabilitation that is required.
Thank you. No, and that really doesn't sound like difficult requests either, right? Just transparency and more explicit human rights standards. That's not a difficult ask. We're running out of time. But I want to make sure we give people in the audience, if you have any questions, please throw them in the chat and we can discuss them. But before we get to that, while they're thinking up the questions and writing them out, just one more question for the panel. We like to end with trying to be as productive as possible. So say I'm a person that listened to this discussion. I got either excited or nervous about my country's transition, mineral policy or approach or whatever. What options exist for the average person to have a say in this discourse, be it on the country level or the international level? Is it, let me stop there. What do you think, what would you advise me to someone who wanted to be involved in this space or affect the situation or voice their concerns, be it about the human rights or the environmental challenges? How do we do that, if at all? I'll start with Viola.
Thanks. I think it's commendable that I work a lot with governments, and it's commendable that they've come a long way to involve the civil society, to involve researchers, academia, even private companies in creating, for example, the legal and policy framework to discuss, for example, if there are ongoing changes within the mining sector, whether it's environment, local content, or even the taxation framework. I feel like countries now are, even within their legal regime, there is space for public participation, which is really commendable, or even some of these documents go through consultation process. They're available online, and they invite people to give comments and submit comments and feedback on the policies. So I think countries have now come a long way, but also looking at what civil society, the media, journalists are doing now, it's more important that they're now part of the table. They're making decisions. They're openly talking about these issues, which then as a government, you ask yourself, do you want to work with them or them fighting you for the long time? So I think there's really progress that has been done, and good conversations are now happening involving all the stakeholders.
Okay, that's optimistic. I like it. Vuyisile, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I can also just add that there are a lot of automakers that we have been engaged with in earthworks about their supply chains, about the need to ensure that they conduct environmental and human rights due diligence because of the impact that this would have on communities that are at the mine site level. And in a lot of these engagements with automakers, they are starting to realize the importance of doing that due diligence. So if you are just a normal citizen who is interested in, or just a person who's interested in getting involved in these issues, one way could either be by looking at the automakers. Maybe one of them is an automaker that you use if you can afford an EV, but like holding them accountable for saying that these are clean cars and interrogating how clean their supply chains are. So that's at a consumer level. More in the policy space, what is important and what is required, because as I mentioned earlier, the extent and also Viola mentioned, the extent of these supply chains being global, we more and more need robust policies in the global north, so in the EU, in the US, because of their implications for countries in the global north, just in terms of like supply chain transparency and ensuring that there's due diligence within African countries. Viola mentioned some of the initiatives that are being taken by governments to ensure that they go beyond the point of raw extraction. But as citizens, we also need to ensure that the governments that we're putting into power are the type of governments that are not going to be corrupt and are the type of governments that are going to pass robust laws that can protect and center human rights.
Yeah, I think you could end every Africa policy discussion with your last sentence, and I think that's a really good one. Fitsum, bring us home. How do I not leave this demoralized and jaded?
I think as much as I agree with Vuyisile in terms of the social and environmental impacts of the sector, I think also we can be optimistic about the sector. But I think we have much effort needed in terms of putting the topic in our dialogues, in the debates. I think we need to ask, considering the significant wealth of minerals the continent has, how best can these countries leverage the sector to support economic transformation? And with energy transition, I think for Africa, as much as the debate globally is around transitioning to renewable energy, for Africa, it's really about energy security. And these are some of the issues that need to be debated at every level. So I would say that individuals can take organized initiatives like dialogues to raise awareness, but this must be well informed by experts in the topic, working at universities, government, non-government agencies, the private sector, civil society organizations. But it must start with information dissemination, and then people would be empowered to seek policy reform.
It must start with people understanding the issues. Wonderful. I think that's a wonderful place to end it. Panelists, thank you so very much for joining us. I know it is both criminally early and criminally late where you guys are individually, so I'm very appreciative of your taking the time today. It's been a pleasure. For those who joined us in the audience, thank you so much. Please visit us at theafricacenter.org in the future for more programs, and you can find all the panelists online if you'd like to follow their work or ask them questions offline. Again, thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Home isn't just where we're from. It's the sounds that move us, the stories that shape us, and the flavors that heal us. It's the communities that connect us. The ones that hold us down. The ones that raise us up. Home is a feeling we all know. So if you're looking for it, you can always find it here. The Africa Center. Home is here.
Well, thank you so much, Tunde, and everyone at the Africa Center. It was great meeting you all, and Viola, it was great talking to you.
Yes, so nice to meet you, Vuyisile.
I don't think we can hear you.